Hello, weary traveler. Welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we step back into the brutal winters of medieval times, I want to greet you warmly. Maybe you're tucked under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or maybe you just want to relax with some quiet storytelling. However you arrived, I'm truly glad you're here tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment. It's always a joy to see how many curious minds gather here. And if you enjoy these calm, immersive stories from the past, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. But for now, let's let go of modern stress. Let's travel back to a much colder time, a time when winter wasn't just chilly, it was dangerous, a time when surviving the cold was never a guarantee. Picture yourself in the countryside of medieval Europe. The last leaves have fallen, the sun sits low in the sky, barely giving off any warmth. The ground is hard and frosty. You can hear the crunch of frozen grass under your feet. A breeze picks up, carrying the first flurries of snow. Winter is arriving, and for people back then, that meant one thing: survival would be difficult. The cold didn't rush in. It crept slowly, then stayed for months. Snow blanketed everything. Rivers and ponds froze into sheets of ice. There were no heaters, no cozy insulation. Unless you were rich, warmth was out of reach. But here's the thing, winters weren't always like this. There was a time when seasons came and went with less pain. Snow came as expected, and people adapted. But then the climate changed. Something shifted, and what followed was a time of deep, relentless cold. Historians now call it the Little Ice Age. It began in the 1300s and lasted into the 1800s. Winters grew longer, harsher, and colder than anyone remembered. No one knows exactly why it happened, but the impact was massive. Crops failed, livestock died, people suffered. One winter in particular stands out, the Great Frost of 1709. That year, temperatures dropped so low that rivers and lakes froze completely. In London, the River Thames turned into ice. People set up shops right on top of it. They even lit fires on the frozen surface. It was surreal, magical even, but it came at a terrible cost. Many people froze to death. Homes couldn't keep out the bitter cold. The world outside had turned to solid ice, and yet, in the silence of that winter, some found a strange peace. The frost wrapped the world in stillness, and for a moment the chaos of life paused. In the bitter cold of the Great Frost, not everyone saw only hardship. One young man, Isaac Newton, was a student at Cambridge University when the deep freeze hit. The university shut down, and Newton returned home to his family farm. There, sitting quietly by the fire, he found time to think, to wonder, to explore the mysteries of the world. It was during this unexpected pause that he began forming some of his most brilliant ideas. He laid the groundwork for his theories on calculus and optics. It's incredible to think that the silence of a freezing winter could help ignite the mind of one of history's greatest thinkers. But while stories like Newton's shine, they were rare. For most people living in medieval times, winter was not a season of reflection, it was a season of survival. The wealthy had thick woolen clothes, dry firewood, and food stored safely in their homes. But the peasants and serfs, who made up most of the population, lived very differently. Imagine waking up in a tiny one-room cottage. Smoke from a weak fire fills the air. You can see your breath as you sit up on a straw mattress. Your family huddles close beside you for warmth. The cold seeps in through every wall and every crack. Your fingers and toes ache, stiff from the chill. If there's any breakfast at all, it's a thin bowl of porridge or a piece of stale bread. The food from last season's harvest is running low. You already know that the next few months will bring more hunger, not less. Even the animals feel it. You see your livestock packed tightly in the barn, their fur crusted with frost, their breath turning to mist. They huddle together, just like your family does, trying to stay warm. You step outside to gather firewood. Your hands turn red, then numb. But you keep going. You think about your children's faces, pale from cold, empty from hunger, and you don't stop. You can't. There's no other choice. This was daily life for so many in the medieval world. Every day was a fight against the cold, a fight just to make it through to the next sunrise. And yet, even in all that struggle, people found moments of joy. The medieval world was deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Every season had its rituals, its festivals, its celebrations. And winter, cold and harsh as it was, brought its own sparks of hope. One of those came on December 26th, the feast of St. Stephen. On that day, something special happened. For just a little while, society flipped upside down. A peasant could be crowned the Lord of Misrule, leading the day's wild celebration. People ate, drank, danced, and laughed. It was a break from the hard life, a moment of fun and freedom. And even though it didn't last, it meant everything. One of the most powerful sources of hope during the medieval winter was simple. People came together. In a time when survival depended on your community, the bonds of family and friendship meant everything. Imagine a small village surrounded by snow. The sky is gray, smoke curls from the chimneys, a quiet sign that life still stirs inside. Inside those homes, families gather around the fire. They tell stories. They share whatever food they have left, sometimes just scraps. Neighbors walk through deep snow to check on each other. Someone brings extra firewood. Someone else delivers a pot of stew. Everyone helps. No one is truly alone. The faces in the firelight are tired, but they are strong. This isn't their first winter, and it won't be their last. They've made it through before. They'll do it again. Outside, the cold only deepens. Snow piles higher, ice spreads wider, the nights grow longer. But even then, people look for signs of change, because they know something important. Winter doesn't last forever. Spring always returns. They watch the sky closely. The days begin to stretch, just a little. The earth softens beneath the frozen ground. And when the thaw finally comes, they celebrate it with open arms. The end of winter means life can begin again. Plow Monday marks this turning point. On that day, farmers bring out their tools. The plows, which sat idle all winter, are blessed. Fields are ready. Work begins. Cutting the first lines into the soft earth feels like a small miracle. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief. The worst is over. They made it. The hardship, the cold, the hunger. It didn't break them. The people of medieval Europe had endured again. In today's world of heated homes and stocked shelves, it's hard to imagine facing winters like that. But knowing they did, year after year, is deeply humbling. They suffered, yes, but they also laughed. They found warmth in each other. They discovered joy in the smallest of comforts. And in doing so, they showed us something incredible. The human spirit doesn't break easily. So the next time you feel the sting of cold air or complain about the weather, think of them. Think of the families who survived freezing nights with only fire and each other. Think of their strength, their hope, their unshakable will to keep going. Because in the end, that's what winter teaches best. How strong we really are. The greatest lesson we can learn from the medieval world is this: no matter how dark the night or how cold the wind, the promise of spring is always waiting just around the corner. And with that, dear listener, we reach the end of our journey through the brutal winters of medieval Europe. I hope these stories of hardship and resilience offer a fresh perspective on your own experiences with the cold season. May you always find warmth and comfort in the strength of family and community, just as our ancestors once did. And may the promise of spring light your way, even on the coldest night. Thank you for joining me in this quiet corner of history. If you enjoyed our time together, I'd be so grateful if you subscribed and shared these stories with a friend. There are many more fascinating tales waiting for us. But for now, I'll say good night. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you again soon for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams. Even as winter tightened its icy grip on the medieval world, not even kings and queens were safe from its reach. Behind the stone walls of drafty castles, the cold found its way in. Royal households faced an overwhelming challenge. keeping everyone fed and warm during the darkest months. The demands of winter were massive. Mountains of firewood had to be gathered to keep the hearths burning day and night. In the kitchens, staff worked endlessly to preserve meats, grains, and vegetables that could last through the long, frozen weeks. Servants hurried to plug cracks in stone walls, hoping to block out the chill, but even the best efforts often failed. One tragic tale tells of Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. In January of 1326, she was found frozen in her bed. Inside her own palace, the very walls that were meant to protect her had let her down. Her death became a grim reminder that winter did not care about wealth or status. It came for everyone, and yet, even in such darkness, the human spirit found ways to rise. For ordinary people, one small spark of joy came with the Feast of St. Stephen. Held on December 26th, it was a rare chance to forget the cold and struggle, if only for a day. That day flipped the rules. A peasant could become the lord of misrule and lead the town in laughter, music, and mischief. The poor played the rich, the serious became silly. For a few fleeting hours, people forgot their hunger and pain. They danced, they laughed, they remembered what it felt like to be human. However brief, the Feast of St. Stephen gave people something powerful, a chance to breathe. It let them forget the weight of social rules, at least for a day. The strict lines between lords and peasants faded. For a few hours, everyone feasted, played, and laughed together. It wasn't just fun, it was necessary. These moments of celebration helped people survive not just the cold, but the heavy stress of life under a harsh feudal system. One story from the winter of 1377 shows how powerful this togetherness could be. Two poor families had run out of food. Spring was still far away, but instead of giving up, they came together. They shared the last bits of what they had. On the Feast of St. Stephen, they cooked a small, humble meal. That shared act gave them the strength to keep going. It kept them alive. Stories like this weren't rare. All across medieval Europe, small acts of kindness kept people going. One traveler might give firewood to a freezing stranger. A family might invite a widow in from the cold. These simple gestures often meant the difference between life and death. Winter was brutal. But people didn't face it alone. They faced it together. And in doing so, they built a culture of care. Even when society felt cruel and divided, winter forced people to rely on each other. Still, the joy of celebration couldn't stop the misery from creeping back in. As January turned into February and February dragged into March, even the strongest spirits began to weaken. Food stores ran low, fires struggled to keep homes warm. The bright glow of the Feast of St. Stephen faded into a long gray stretch of cold. But even in those hardest moments, people held on. Year after year, they endured the worst of winter. They suffered, yes, but they survived. Their strength came not just from their bodies, but from their hearts, their will, and the bonds they shared. And then, finally, came the change. The air softened just a little. The days stretched longer. The snow began to melt. Water dripped from icicles. Light returned. No day brought more hope than Plow Monday. The first Monday after Epiphany in early January. It marked the beginning of the farming season. People brought out their plows, ready to dig back into the soil. The ground was still hard, winter wasn't over, but spring was coming, and that was enough. The ritual of Plow Monday gave people something solid to hold on to, a symbol of hope. It reminded them that no matter how long winter lasted, spring would return. You could see it in the land. Frozen fields began to thaw. Patches of earth appeared beneath melting snow. Farmers brought out their plows. Teams of oxen leaned into the soil, breaking through the icy top layer. With each cut into the frozen ground, people pushed winter back and welcomed the sun. This simple act, plowing the land, was more than just work. It was a fight, a statement. It said, "We are still here." After months of cold and hunger, after sickness and struggle, they still had the strength to begin again. Today, many of us can't imagine what that was like. We have heaters, electric blankets, full cupboards, and sturdy homes. If the weather gets rough, We complain about traffic or canceled flights, but in medieval times, winter was truly cruel. It was long, it was freezing, and it was deadly. Our ancestors didn't have backup plans. They didn't have warm cars or grocery delivery. They had each other, and not much else. But even in those brutal months, they managed to celebrate. They shared food, told stories, and stayed close. Their ability to find joy in such a harsh world is almost hard to believe, and yet they did it. Year after year, not just surviving but living, with laughter, love, and a kind of strength we rarely call upon today. So the next time we grumble about a cold morning or a traffic jam, maybe we should remember them. Remember their fight, their courage, and their deep, quiet hope. Let their stories remind us we carry that same spirit within us. We are not as fragile as we think. As the new year arrived and Plough Monday passed, medieval life settled into its winter rhythm once again. The days stayed short, the nights stayed cold, the lucky ones gathered near smoky hearths inside old stone manors. The poor, they battled the cold with whatever scraps they had. And winter brought more than cold, it brought illness. In those dark, damp cottages, where people lived close together and clean water was scarce, disease spread fast. A simple cold was enough to make life miserable. Red noses, blurred eyes, constant coughing. It wore people down, but the real danger came with bigger illnesses. Influenza hit hard. Fevers, chills, body aches. It could knock down anyone, young or old. And in a world with no medicine, no vaccines, and little help, flu outbreaks were terrifying. They didn't just make people sick, they took lives. The winter of 1557 was especially cruel. A deadly strain of influenza swept through Europe like wildfire. In Paris alone, over 10,000 people died. Pneumonia also struck with quiet brutality. It often followed hunger or other illnesses. The cold, damp air crept into people's lungs, their bodies filled with fluid. Many died slowly, struggling to breathe. It was like drowning from the inside out. Crowded homes made it worse. Families shared small, unventilated spaces. Once one person got sick, the rest quickly followed. Entire households could be wiped out. Children were left orphaned. Lives were shattered overnight. Even kings and queens weren't safe. Royal courts were always full of guests, diplomats, travelers, entertainers. With every visitor came the risk of sickness. Disease spread quickly in these busy spaces. Henry VIII's wife, Jane Seymour, died from complications after childbirth, most likely made worse by poor hygiene and the unsanitary medical practices of the time. But the greatest victims were often the smallest, children, especially babies born in the winter. Weak from birth, they faced freezing temperatures, limited food, and dirty water. Many didn't make it past their 5th birthday. In London, during the 1500s, half of all children died before age 5. One heartbreaking custom shows how common this was. Families would tie a black ribbon to a baby's hand if the child was very sick. If the baby died, that same ribbon would be used to tie their burial shroud. It was a quiet, tragic sign of how often grief visited medieval homes. For the poor, winter was not just hard, it was merciless. Firewood was scarce. Strict laws often banned people from collecting wood from forests, so peasants burned dried dung or straw to stay warm. They shared this meager heat with animals. Livestock huddled close, their breath visible in the icy air. Food was just as scarce. Most meals came from what was stored in the fall. Salted meat, dried peas, coarse bread. The bounty of harvest was a distant memory, and spring felt far away. To survive, families foraged for whatever they could find. Nettles, garlic, mushrooms. They tossed these into a pot, hoping to create something warm. A simple stew might contain beans, peas, salted pork, and if they were lucky, a few wild onions. It wasn't tasty, it wasn't much, but it kept them alive. Even this humble meal was a gift. A bad storm or failed crop could wipe out food supplies completely. One harsh winter could mean starvation for an entire village. The Great Famine of 1315 was one of the most harrowing winters in medieval history. It wasn't just the cold. It was the endless rain. Across northern Europe, fields were soaked, crops rotted where they stood. Nothing could grow. People ran out of food, and hunger spread like wildfire. Desperate times led to desperate actions. Some reports say people ate dogs and horses. Others whisper about something darker, human flesh. In their despair, some parents even smothered their starving children, seeing it as an act of mercy. Streets and fields were filled with unburied bodies. There were simply too many to lay to rest. But this famine wasn't a rare disaster. While its scale was unusual, crop failures and food shortages were a constant threat. Every winter, people lived on the edge, never sure if they'd make it to spring. Meals were meager. A bad harvest could push a family from hunger to starvation. Winter didn't just test the body, it shaped the culture. It touched everything: entertainment, religion, even crime and punishment. Life became slower and smaller. Travel was dangerous, days were short. So people stayed inside, leaning on each other for warmth and comfort. The Yule gatherings gave way to quieter evenings. Families huddled close. With no distractions outside, people turned inward. They told stories, they sang songs. They did what they could to pass the time. The soft glow of candles or rushlights lit up these scenes. Women sewed, men carved, children listened. Keeping your hands busy wasn't just a way to stay productive, it was a shield against despair. In the coldest months, having a task meant having purpose. For the few who could read, winter was also a time for books. But books were rare. In the late 1400s, a common tradesman might only own a Bible, a prayer book, and maybe a few cheerful tales like the adventures of Robin Hood. The rich, of course, had beautiful hand-decorated volumes, but most readers shared their stories aloud, so the whole family could listen. Winter was perfect for storytelling. Tales of brave knights, clever tricksters, and doomed lovers filled the rooms. King Arthur's court, with its magic and honor, was a favorite. These stories helped people escape their cold, dark homes and travel, if only in their minds. Not all winter fun was wholesome. Gambling was a favorite pastime. Dice clattered across tavern tables, fortunes were lost and tempers flared. The taverns echoed with cheers and curses. And, of course, there was drinking. Ale, mead, and wine flowed freely in many homes and public houses. These drinks didn't just warm the body, they lifted the spirit. For a little while, they helped people forget the cold outside. Winter didn't just quiet the fields, it loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. People gathered in taverns where mugs of ale sparked lively debates, bold songs, and sometimes even a brawl or two. But as much as winter brought noise and drink, it also invited reflection. The short, dark days naturally pulled people inward. And for many in medieval times, that meant turning toward God. The church played a central role in daily life. And winter offered a pause from labor, a perfect time for deeper devotion. With the fields frozen and the animals needing less care, people had more time for prayer, penance, and acts of charity. Christmas brought nativity plays and festive pageants, but as the season deepened, celebrations turned quieter, more solemn. Some chose to go on pilgrimages, walking miles through snow and mud to reach holy places. Their hardships were seen as a sign of faith. Others spent hours in cold stone churches, wrapped in cloaks, fingering rosary beads, and praying silently for peace, health, or forgiveness. Charity became a key part of the winter season. Even when food was scarce, helping others was seen as a moral duty. The 7 acts of mercy guided this mindset: feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit prisoners, care for the sick, and bury the dead. Even small gestures, a bowl of soup, a spare cloak, could mean the difference between survival and loss. But not all hearts stayed kind. As winter dragged on, desperation grew. Crime often rose during these months. People grew restless indoors. Arguments flared. Theft increased as supplies ran low. Assaults became more common, especially in crowded living spaces. Medieval jails were cold and overcrowded. Justice moved slowly in winter. Trials were delayed. Accused men and women waited for weeks or months in freezing cells. When court finally resumed, Punishments were often harsh: fines, floggings, and sometimes public executions. Still, the human spirit pushed forward. People found moments of joy and light even in the darkest days. February brought one such moment, the feast of Saint Valentine on the 14th. What began as a pagan fertility ritual was reimagined as a Christian celebration of love. By the 15th century, Valentine's Day had become a cherished custom. Young men and women gathered to draw names from a bowl, choosing their Valentine for the year. These pairings sparked cheerful flirtations and sometimes even led to marriage. Flowers, sweets, and love poems were exchanged. A simple handmade card from a secret admirer could make hearts flutter, even in the middle of a snowstorm. Winter, for all its suffering, could not freeze the fire of love. As the worst of the season began to fade, people sensed that brighter days were coming. Snowdrops and crocuses poked their fragile heads through the frost, quiet signs that winter's grip was loosening at last. Throughout the Middle Ages, the changing seasons shaped every part of life. But winter left the deepest mark. Surviving it was no small feat. It required patience, grit, and relentless endurance. Winter was a trial of the human spirit, a time when faith, family, and community mattered more than ever. The postcard scenes we imagine today, frosty meadows, icicles glinting in the sun, hid brutal realities: bitter cold, hunger, sickness, and death. But in that hardship, people found strength. They were shaped by snow and silence, by firelight and prayer. Next time you grumble about a wet sock or a frozen windshield, think of them. They had no thermal boots, no heaters, no weather forecasts, just a smoky fire, a patched cloak, and sheer determination to see spring return. Yet somehow, year after year, they endured. We are their descendants, the heirs of their strength. Their survival carved the path that led to our present. So as you settle under your warm blanket tonight, remember those who came before. Not with pity, but with pride, because they tamed the wildest season not with tools, but with spirit. And just as the sun began to return, weak and pale behind gray clouds, life stirred again. The people of medieval Europe, still cloaked in rags and wrapped in cold, began to move forward. The hunger remained, the hardship hadn't vanished, but something had shifted. The worst was passing. Huddled together, breath misting in the frigid air, they clung to the warmth of each other and the promise of another spring. Even the animals shared in this hope. The old horse dreamed of green pastures. The cows groaned in the cold barns. The barn cats, no longer proud, curled close by the fire, their fur frosted with dew. Everything waited, thin, quiet, shivering, but not broken. Winter was especially brutal for those at the bottom of medieval society, but even the nobles, tucked away in their grand, drafty castles, weren't spared from the season's cruelty. Stone walls, no matter how tall, couldn't keep out the chill. Silken gowns looked elegant at feasts, but were useless against damp, icy air. Blue-blooded maidens wept in cold chambers, wrapped in layers that barely helped. Even royalty suffered. King Henry II of England, legend says, was once so overcome by winter's chill that he ordered an entire chair burned just to warm his backside for a moment. His servants trembled not just from the cold, but from the fear of his infamous temper. A cold and uncomfortable king was far more dangerous than any frozen night. But whether peasant or monarch, winter pressed down on everyone with equal weight. It dragged on endlessly, a slow grind of numb fingers, frozen paths, and aching bones. Relief came only in the form of feast days and holy celebrations, brief sparks of warmth and joy in the season's long shadow. Among the most beloved was the Feast of St. Stephen on December 26th. It was a day of merriment, of mischief, of glorious reversals. By tradition, a peasant was chosen as the lord of misrule, given license to boss around nobles and play king for a day. The lowliest serf could mock the baron, order him about with mock serious commands, and all would laugh. For one rare moment, the rigid rules of status crumpled. Laughter rang through the halls. The cold didn't seem to matter. People danced, sang, drank, and forgot the misery outside. It was a wild, joyful rebellion, a kind of shared magic that reminded them they were more than their station, more than their burdens. But soon enough the feast would end. The Lord of Misrule would return to his plow, the Baron would take back his title, the fire would die, and winter would return, with its usual silence. People trudged back to their routines, the wind now seeming to mock their fleeting joy. Yet even as the cold returned, so did the quiet courage of everyday people. Neighbors shared what little they had, a bit of grain here, a wool scrap there. In York, a woman named Dame Matilda gave her only cloak to a beggar shivering in the snow. When asked why she'd give away her last defense against the cold, she simply smiled and said, "The warmth of human kindness is a fire that never goes out. That spirit, kind, defiant, unbreakable, was what truly kept people going." Winter could freeze the land, numb the fingers, and darken the sky, but it couldn't extinguish the light within them. That inner warmth, the invincible summer in their hearts, was what allowed them to endure. When spring finally began to stir, it wasn't just a change in weather, it was a celebration of survival. The first green buds were more than beautiful, they were proof that the people had made it through the worst. After months of darkness, hunger, and bitter cold, even a single crocus poking through thawing soil felt like a miracle. It meant the land was healing. And so were its people. Villagers emerged from their cramped homes slowly, blinking in the longer daylight like bears shaking off hibernation. Children kicked off the weight of winter, their boots splashing through melting snow and squelching mud. Laughter returned to the air. Faces once hardened by cold, now softened with smiles. Blue Monday marked the true beginning of the season. On the first Monday after Epiphany, farmers prepared to return to the fields. Draft horses and oxen, freshly garlanded with ribbons and flowers, were paraded through village lanes. Church bells rang as the procession passed, signaling hope for a new growing season. After months of silence and smoke-choked chimneys, communities now filled with sound, movement, and purpose. Even the food began to change. No longer reliant on salted meat and stale bread, people anticipated the return of fresh greens and milk. Soon, gardens would yield spring onions, young herbs, and soft new cheese. It was a slow shift, but a deeply felt one. Their diets would finally brighten again, along with their spirits. For modern people, spring might mean switching wardrobes or losing an hour to daylight savings, but for those in medieval times, it meant they had outlasted death's season. It was life-affirming in the most literal way. Each sunrise came a little earlier, and each breath of air smelled a little sweeter. To survive a medieval winter was no small thing. It was a personal victory, shared across households, parishes, and kingdoms. The bare trees slowly wrapped themselves in green again, and with them, a sense of renewal blossomed in every heart. Spring didn't just thaw the ground, it lifted hearts. The world began to bloom again, and with it came a deep, collective sigh of relief. The fresh green of the fields mirrored the renewed hope in people's hearts, and that joy, it echoed across centuries. Lively medieval folk tunes and verses celebrated this sweet return of life, none more famous than the cheerful English song that urged, "Loudly sing cuckoo, the seed is growing, the meadow is blooming, the woods are springing anew." These weren't just pretty lines, they captured raw, honest joy, the kind that comes only after months of survival. Imagine the sheer relief of opening your shutters and letting in not snow, but warm air and birdsong. That kind of emotional release filled people with a zest for life that's hard to describe today. But it wasn't just about nature blooming again, it was about the soul breathing again. Still, even with spring on the horizon, winter hadn't fully loosened its grip. Bitter winds continued to blow, and the ground remained frozen in many places. Yet, even then, communities held each other up. Villagers shared food, no matter how little they had. They rotated homes to host simple meals, just to make sure no one ate alone. In many towns, the young were assigned to look after the old. One such young man, Tom, trudged through deep snow to reach the hut of Agnes, a frail widow living on her own. She had nearly given up trying to light a fire. Her hands were stiff with cold. But Tom arrived with firewood, dried peas, and a chunk of salted pork. gifts gathered by the village. He knelt by her hearth, coaxed a flame to life, and watched as warmth returned to her home and her faith. Tears welled in Agnes's eyes, not just because she could feel her fingers again, but because someone had remembered her, cared for her. In a world where survival took everything, these quiet acts of kindness were powerful. They were what made life not just bearable, but meaningful. And his spirit of giving reached beyond the poor. Even noble families took part. Lady Margaret, the Baron's wife, often organized donations from the manor's kitchen. Bread, broth, fabric scraps, everything counted. The hard season made even the highest born more aware of the humanity they shared with those below. It was this shared resilience, this stubborn compassion, that truly defined the people of the Middle Ages. Through storms and hunger, they never lost their will to care. Lady Margaret was known throughout the region for her generosity during the coldest months of the year. Though her castle larders were well stocked, she insisted on sending wagons filled with grain and preserved food to the poorest peasants in her husband's domain. Some of her noble peers scoffed at this. To them, peasants were little more than livestock. Why waste fine provisions on them? But Lady Margaret stood firm. Her Christian faith taught her to care for the vulnerable. When a particularly harsh winter brought famine to the region, she refused to look away. She directed her cooks to prepare thick stews and broths from whatever they had left in the stores. Kitchen boys grumbled at the extra labor, but Cook Bernard, a round, red-cheeked man with a soft heart, shared her commitment. He tossed every last turnip and potato into the bubbling pots, along with scraps of salted meat and bone. Each day, starving villagers lined up outside the castle gates. They cupped steaming bowls in their frozen hands, grateful for even the thinnest broth. For some, that meal would be the only food they tasted all week. Lady Margaret watched them with quiet resolve. When the stores ran low, she sold her jewels in secret, rings, pendants, even a prized sapphire brooch, to buy supplies from nearby town. Her husband, the Earl, never questioned her. Though he worried about their own reserves, he respected her devotion. He understood that nobility was not just about bloodlines. It was about duty. The church also did its part. Monasteries opened their doors to the sick and cold, offering warm straw beds and simple meals of bread and ale. Some monks even ran primitive hospitals. To them, healing the suffering was not just charity, it was a way to live the compassion of Christ. Brother William, a young novice, worked in one such hospital. The stench of rot and sickness often made his stomach turn, but he stayed. He ladled broth into trembling hands and tended to frostbitten feet and festering sores. At night, he knelt beside the chapel fire, whispering prayers for strength and mercy. Winter had taught him humility and purpose. Yet even with all these acts of kindness, no one was immune to the dangers of the season. Winter leveled all rich and poor alike. The wealthy had furs and wine, but they still huddled in drafty chambers and watched their stores dwindle. Death did not care for titles or wealth. Lady Isabel, a noblewoman in late pregnancy, was confined to her rooms during a brutal cold snap. Her bed was soft, her hearth well fed, and her maids attentive, but sickness slipped in quietly. A kitchen girl, pale and coughing, served her warm milk laced with herbs. Within days, Lady Isabel was burning with fever. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged. The baby came too soon. The child, just a wisp of a thing, never drew breath. By week's end, Lady Isabel was gone too. Her room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the hushed weeping of her maid. Even royalty couldn't escape winter's grip. King Henry VI, known for his gentle spirit, worried deeply about the suffering of his people during the dreadful winter of 1433. His physicians prescribed cinnamon and ginger tonics to balance the cold humors, but nothing lifted his melancholy. He sat for hours near the hearth, hands outstretched, unable to feel warmth. Some whispered his depression was punishment from God for his softness as a ruler, but what he suffered was something more universal, something that touched peasants and kings alike. Seasonal sadness, isolation, and the endless gray days wore down even the strongest. And yet, people endured. They always had. And as the sun began to climb just a little higher in the sky, a shift began. people dared to hope again. They prayed the thaw would come soon, that the first buds would peek from bare branches, that life would return to the land. And when it did, when winter's icy grip loosened just enough, they celebrated. Plough Monday arrived, the first Monday after Epiphany. Villagers gathered to symbolically break the frozen earth. Men blackened their faces with soot for good luck and paraded down muddy lanes with plowshares held high. They sang bawdy songs to stir the sleeping soil. There was dancing, laughter, and hot ale. It wasn't just about farming, it was about rebirth. In grand halls, noble families celebrated with music and dances. Minstrels strummed cheerful tunes as couples spun across stone floors. At court, the king hosted a feast with roast swan and marzipan sweets. For a moment, it seemed the whole world was waking up again. And even in the poorest homes, joy returned. Giles, a humble farmer, stood beside his family as they stepped into their small plot of land. He clutched a pouch of saved seeds like it was treasure. It was. It meant the difference between hunger and survival. And Agnes, the widow left nearly for dead just months earlier, stood in her doorway stirring a bubbling pot of pottage. She hummed to herself, not quite on key, but full of life. She had made it through, praise be to God. Yes, winter was cruel. It brought pain, hunger, sickness, and fear. But it also brought out the best in people, their compassion, their resolve, their fierce will to survive. Faced with the endless cold and creeping death, the people of medieval Europe didn't give up. They gave more. They leaned on each other. And when the darkness finally passed, they emerged, not broken, but stronger. Spare a moment to think of your medieval ancestors, how they weathered winter after winter in a world without central heating, electric blankets, or groceries delivered to their doorstep. Their hardships dwarf our modern complaints. Yet, in many ways, their struggles carry powerful lessons. Lessons of empathy, community, and the enduring promise of spring. Today, we may groan about a broken boiler or a delayed delivery, but centuries ago, families faced death with every snowstorm. Despite that, they leaned on one another, shared what little they had, and clung to hope. Maybe that's the lesson we need most, whether we're facing a winter storm or a global crisis. It's kindness, charity, and resilience that carry us through. The deeper the snow, the sweeter the thaw. The colder the nights, the brighter the spring sun feels on your face. As one medieval monk might say, "Let us winter bravely, so that we may spring eternally." Imagine the frost crackling beneath your boots. Your breath fogs the air. Snowdrifts line the path as you pass homes wrapped in silence, smoke rising from crooked chimneys. Icicles dangle like crystal daggers from thatched roofs. This wasn't some cozy scene from a holiday card. For most people in the Middle Ages, this was survival mode. The threat of starvation never truly vanished during winter. Crops were long gone, animals had been slaughtered, smoked, or eaten. Families relied on whatever they had stored: bitter herbs, shriveled root vegetables, and stale bread. If supplies ran out, there was no help coming. One brutal winter in 1315 saw storms destroy a third of England's crops. Some villagers were so desperate, they boiled leather from shoes or chewed straw from their roofs. Malnutrition made everything worse. Weak bodies caught colds easily and couldn't fight them off. A cough could turn into pneumonia. Influenza spread like wildfire in tiny, smoky homes packed with people and animals. In one Suffolk cottage, 13 family members, plus chickens and dogs, crammed together in a single smoky room through the entire season. That any of them lived to see spring is almost a miracle. Then there was fire. In close quarters, one stray ember could turn a thatched home into an inferno. In cities, flames could jump from rooftop to rooftop. Entire streets vanished in a single night. Families scrambled into the snow with nothing but the clothes on their backs, if they were lucky. Fires weren't just dangers, they were disasters. When homes were heated by open flames and candles, a small spark could erase entire neighborhoods. The Great Fire of London in 1212 began on a cold November night. Flames quickly leapt through the city's narrow lanes while water froze in the pipes. Thousands perished. More were left to huddle homeless in the bitter cold, their lives reduced to ash. Travel during winter was no less perilous. Roads turned to deep mud or vanished under snowdrifts. With daylight scarce, travelers often became disoriented, veering off paths into the woods or onto frozen rivers. Some never made it back. In 1311, Queen Isabella of England set out from Canterbury to London. As dusk fell, her party lost the road in a blizzard. They wandered in the dark for hours, while the pregnant queen wept in fear and exhaustion. They survived, but just barely. Even animals weren't spared. Horses and oxen, essential to every part of medieval life, grew weak on poor feed. You could see their ribs. Their breath steamed in the cold as they strained to haul carts through snow. Frostbite claimed hooves. Ice shattered wheels. Still, they trudged on, loyal and patient. And yet, in the middle of this bleak season, people still found room for celebration. The feast of St. Stephen, what we now call Boxing Day, offered warmth and generosity. Churches collected donations for the poor. Lords opened their kitchens to feed tenants who had nothing. For one day, the lines between rich and poor blurred. Hunger was met with hot food. Cold was chased away by laughter. There was also mischief. The tradition of the Lord of Misrule flipped the social order. A lowly jester, a servant, even a child might be crowned king for the day. They gave silly orders, drank too much, and mocked authority. Everyone laughed, even the nobles. These moments of joy didn't just distract from the suffering. They reminded people that joy was still possible. Despite the cold, the sickness, and the hunger, hope endured. It drifted from mouths in frosty breaths. It was whispered in nighttime prayers. Please, let the weak survive. Let the stores last. Let spring come soon. So next time you grumble about shoveling snow or groan when the heat cuts out, remember those who came before. They didn't have thermal coats or emergency services. They faced winter with courage and faith. And they made it through, not because they had comfort, but because they had each other. So with that, let's get going. With a lot of their resilience is still with us. It's in every act of kindness, every meal shared, every effort to bring warmth to another. Even though their names are forgotten, their legacy remains. They endured the hardest winters, and so can we. Fires burned day and night, but their warmth was fleeting. The smoke stung eyes and choked lungs. Inside the dim, packed huts of villagers, people huddled together with their animals for body heat. The air was thick with the smells of dung, damp straw, and unwashed bodies, a scent that could only belong to winter in the Middle Ages. Yet even this uncomfortable shelter was more than some could afford. Food stores were nearly gone. Hunger gnawed constantly. The poorest families lived on little more than hard bread and weak gruel, hoping they'd last until spring. Famine was not an abstract fear. It was a reality in nearly every home. Winter didn't care about class. It struck down peasants and nobles alike. Even royalty wasn't safe in their damp stone castles. These massive buildings swallowed warmth and breathed out cold. Fires roared in every hearth, but the damp crept in through the walls. Vast stores of firewood were needed just to keep the royal household alive. If a kingdom didn't prepare in time, its people and its rulers suffered. One haunting story tells of a Bohemian princess who died in her bedchamber from the cold. Despite her rank, despite the furs piled on her bed, she didn't survive. Wealth offered little protection against nature's cruelty. For peasant families, losing someone to the cold was so common it barely shocked anyone anymore. And then came disease. Fevers, coughs, and infections spread fast through weakened bodies and crowded homes. The smoky air and filthy surroundings made breathing even harder. Medicine was mostly superstition. Doctors relied on prayers and guesswork. Real cures were rare. Winter made travel dangerous, too. Roads vanished under snow and ice. Only the truly desperate left their homes during these months. Peddlers stayed put. Taxes went uncollected. Villages became cut off, isolated, and alone. And yet, even in this season of stillness, war marched on. In 1407, one of winter's most surprising victories took place. The Welsh rebel leader Owain Glyndwr, used to fighting in harsh conditions, drew King Henry V's larger army into the mountains during a blizzard. As snow blinded the English troops and their armor weighed them down, Glyndwr's men struck. The English lines crumbled. Many froze to death in their retreat. It wasn't just strategy that brought Glyndwr victory. It was the winter itself. His triumph became legend. And once again, the brutal season proved its power. Not just over bodies, but over empires. Winter often meant more than just cold. It brought death by hunger. When spring planting was delayed or failed due to prolonged frost or rain, the consequences were swift and deadly. One of the worst examples was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. That spring was unusually wet and cold, rotting seeds before they could grow. Fields turned to muck, crops failed. For 2 years in a row, people across Europe starved. In England, the price of bread soared to 20 times its normal cost. For the poor, food became a fantasy. They boiled grass, they ate roots and the bark off trees. Some even dug up graves to feed on the dead. In some places, up to a quarter of the population perished. Cities like Ypres and Bruges in modern-day Belgium saw entire neighborhoods disappear. In the French town of Troyes, one citizen wrote that the desperate were eating dogs, horses, and anything else they could find. The famine didn't just bring hunger, it sparked chaos. Theft and violence became common. The weak stole from the weaker. Disease swept in like a second wave of death. One of the most heartbreaking stories comes from the St. Mary's Abbey Chronicles. A starving pregnant woman stole a loaf of bread. The baker refused her plea, so she took it and was caught. The judges showed no mercy. She was sentenced to death. At the gallows, as she was hanged, her unborn child was forced from her body. It fell to the ground, bloodied and screaming. No one moved to help. The infant died where it landed, unnoticed, unloved, and already forgotten. It wasn't until 1318, when the weather warmed and crops grew again, that the famine finally loosened its grip. But its shadow remained. Every winter afterward brought the same fear. Would food run out again? Would the cold win this time? Malnutrition left people too weak to fight off disease. Cramped, smoky homes became breeding grounds for sickness. Influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia spread fast. Even something as simple as a cough could kill. People huddled close to fires, sharing not just warmth, but illness. A winter cold could easily turn fatal. And the doctors? They offered little real help. Most believed in balancing the body's humors. That meant bleeding patients or giving them laxatives. Emperor Charlemagne is believed to have died from pneumonia in the brutal winter of 814, after being treated with poultices and ointments, none of which helped. Historians agree that winter made plagues deadlier. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, it found a population weakened by years of winter hardship. Huddled in tight quarters with poor hygiene, people stood little chance. Between 1348 and 1349, the plague killed between 30% to 60% of Europe's population. One man, Sir Luca from Pistoia, Italy, wrote to his brother, "I am sick at heart and can barely bring myself to write. Things here go from bad to worse." His grief echoed the silence that followed so many cold nights. Shops are closed, taverns deserted. One passes down streets without meeting a soul. Wails of grief echo from houses where death has struck. The stench of rot rises from mass graves. I fear our city may soon be empty of life entirely. I beg you, stay where you are and pray for us unceasingly. This plea came from a terrified citizen during the Black Death. As plague raged across medieval Europe, entire villages were wiped out. Winter only made it worse. The ground was too hard to bury the dead, so bodies were left in frozen piles. Some were dragged to the edge of towns and abandoned in the snow. Sick people were often forced out of their homes, left to die alone in fields or forests. Contagion bred cruelty. The psychological wounds ran deep. After the worst winters of plague, survivors were changed forever. Trust faded, joy dimmed, grief became a daily companion. Winter was especially cruel to the elderly, children, and expectant mothers. Without medicine, without warmth, these vulnerable souls perished in high numbers. Some estimates say that up to 30% of infants in medieval Europe died before their first birthday, many of them in winter. Malnutrition and disease made pregnancy dangerous. Cold made it deadly. One heartbreaking story comes from the royal house itself. In the winter of 1120, Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry III of England, sailed aboard the White Ship from France to England. The vessel struck a rock and began to sink. Matilda made it into a lifeboat, but when she heard her half-brother William crying out in the freezing water, she begged the rowers to turn back. They did. As the rescue boat returned, desperate survivors tried to climb in. The boat capsized. Matilda, pregnant with her first child, was thrown back into the icy sea. She and hundreds of others drowned. When King Henry received the news, he collapsed. He never smiled again for the rest of his life. Old men froze in their beds, children died in their mother's arms. In the epic poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, even King Arthur is shown shivering beneath his heavy robes in a cold stone hall, his teeth chattering mid-sentence. That image wasn't fiction, it was familiar. Nature did not spare kings or commoners. The elements were often stronger than swords or crowns. In 1216, King John of England learned that firsthand. While fleeing rebellion through a marshland known as the Wash, he attempted to cross during a fierce storm. His baggage train, laden with gold, armor, and the crown jewels, was caught in a sudden tidal surge. Horses, carts, and treasures were all swept away. King John barely survived. The jewels were never seen again. Winter wasn't just a backdrop to these tragedies. It was often the main character, a force so relentless, even monarchs bowed to it. King John never recovered from the loss of his royal treasure. He died of dysentery just days later, a broken man. Many historians believe the disaster at the Wash was the final blow that sent him to his grave. Winter brought more than just frostbite and hunger. It brought catastrophe. On St. Martin's Day, November 11, in the year 1099, a massive sea flood struck England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it as one of the worst in memory. A great sea flood through the length of this land overran it so far as no man remembered it ever did before. Entire towns vanished. Countless lives were lost. 2 centuries later, in 1219, the Netherlands suffered a similar fate. On January 16th, a North Sea flood submerged vast portions of the country. More than 50,000 people drowned. With no warning systems, no radio, and no sturdy flood barriers, medieval people were at the mercy of nature. All they could do was pray as icy water surged through their homes and winds howled like demons tearing through the sky. And just as water could kill, so too could fire. Winters drove people indoors, closer to candles, to cooking flames, to open hearths. That's when the real danger crept in. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of a terrible blaze in 1132 that began on London Bridge. It moved with terrifying speed. Before it could be contained, it consumed a large part of the city, including the great church of St. Paul and even parts of Canterbury Cathedral. Wind carried flaming beams and molten lead far beyond the fire's origin. Most of London's buildings were made of wood, jammed tightly together. All it took was one spark. And in winter, when the winds howled and people clustered together for warmth, that spark became a firestorm. People fled through narrow alleys, their homes engulfed in flame. Many carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. In the confusion, families became separated, children were trampled. Some people never made it out. Firefighting was nearly non-existent. Buckets of water or snow were all that stood between survival and destruction. There were no engines, no fire hoses, no sirens. Often, the only hope was that the wind would turn. Even when the skies were calm, winter had one more trick: cold that simply wouldn't go away. We, with our radiators and electric blankets, can barely imagine it, but medieval cold was relentless. The fires in smoky huts gave off more smoke than heat. The stone walls of castles drank warmth and gave back only chill. People wrapped themselves in furs and huddled close, but still, the cold seeped into their bones. Arthritis, rheumatism, and bone aches were common. The elderly felt it the worst. joints stiffening until movement became agony. Fingers turned purple, toes blackened. For many, winter didn't need to bring a storm to kill. It only needed time. Toes turned numb, then black with frostbite. Pneumonia and influenza ran rampant in close quarters. The cold didn't just attack the body, it seemed to reach the soul, draining energy and willpower. The 6th century British monk Gildas once described it this way: "The nights are long and dark, the days dreary and chill. The air bites with malice. The icy blasts cut to the bone. All is blanketed in snow and frost. It is a time of great suffering for man and beast alike." His words weren't poetic exaggeration. For the elderly and frail, winter wasn't just a season, it was a sentence. People wore every scrap of clothing they owned. They piled together under thinning blankets. Yet no matter how tightly they huddled, the cold still crept in. Fires struggled against damp air, often giving more smoke than warmth. The stinging haze filled homes, burning eyes and throats. Coughs echoed in the silence, followed by the groans of the sick. It was a dark, heavy stillness, broken only by wheezing breaths or soft weeping. Cold didn't respect the strong. Even the young and healthy moved like they were underwater. Slow, heavy, half-frozen. There was no escape, no vacations to warmer lands, no heaters or electric blankets. The cold was a constant, merciless companion. In the Middle Ages, time wasn't marked by birthdays or calendars. It was measured in winters survived. To live through one more frost-filled season was a triumph. To reach spring was a victory. Still, despite everything, despite the starvation, the sickness, the isolation, people endured. They pressed forward year after year, winter after winter, armored only with hope and stubborn will. When food ran low, they tightened their belts. When the fire faded to embers, they pulled blankets tighter. When night fell like a lid, they told stories of light and spring. One 14th century poem, Piers Plowman, captured this quiet resilience. The woe and winter's bale, frost and snow and sleet and hail, long shall pass and peace prevail. Hope shall triumph and never fail. Even in the darkest times, small joys survived. Neighbors shared what they had, families sang or prayed together. Some claimed to hear angels whispering in the wind, promises of warmth and light yet to come. Through it all, the people of the Middle Ages held fast to hope. They clung to life, and in their eyes always was the horizon, where spring waited. Spring lay in wait. Deep down, they knew. No matter how brutal or endless winter seemed, it was only ever temporary. The sun would return, the snow would melt, and the world would bloom again, green, alive, and beautiful, as if winter had never come at all. All they had to do was hold on. And they did, again and again, with a strength shaped by the very ice and stone around them. The winters of the Middle Ages were harsh, unforgiving, and often deadly. They brought hunger, disease, fire, and floods. They broke bodies, but they built character. That brutal cold brought out something else too: human resilience, the will to survive, to keep hoping, to come together, to share, to protect one another. The medieval world was shaped in winter's icy forge, and from it emerged people who were wiser, tougher, and deeply grateful when the seasons finally turned. Maybe there's something we can learn from them. We gripe about clearing a few inches of snow from our windshields or the chill that sneaks through the cracks in our doors. But for them, winter was a threat to life itself, a season that demanded courage and tested the soul. And still, they faced it with grit and determination. They passed down stories of these battles, not of glory in war, but of everyday survival, of holding out until the frosts cracked and the birds returned, of lighting one more fire, baking one last loaf, wrapping one more child in whatever scraps of warmth they had left. And in their stories, we see something powerful, the enduring fire of the human spirit. The people of the Middle Ages stared straight into winter's frozen face and never gave in. They endured floods and famine. They braved icy storms and pitch-black nights. They buried their dead in frozen ground and rose each morning to the moans of the starving. And yet, they never let go of spring. If they could face winter with nothing but faith, furs, and fierce will, then surely we can face our own dark days with the same strength. Because in the end, winter always breaks, the thaw always comes, light returns. That's the real lesson from their long cold nights. We endure and we rise. As medieval families gathered near the hearth, huddled close for warmth, they told stories of the winters they had already survived. Stories of fierce storms and quiet triumphs, of the way even the smallest act of kindness, a shared meal, a woven blanket, a whispered prayer, could hold back the dark. From peasants in drafty cottages to nobles in vast but frigid halls, everyone knew the sting of winter's breath. Shutters rattled, frost crept through the cracks, fingers went numb. But as long as the fire burned, so did hope. Even in the grand castles of the highborn, winter was a force to be feared. Giant hearths blazed in great halls, consuming mountains of firewood. Servants scurried endlessly, feeding the flames and shivering as cold drafts crept through stone walls. Not even the richest furs could fully shut out the chill. Beyond the glow of the fire, darkness and frost reclaimed the room. For peasants, the fight against the cold was even grimmer. Their homes were tiny huts made of rough timber and mud. Heat came from scraps of wood or peat, when they could find any. Families pressed together in smoky, suffocating spaces, wrapped in worn wool, sharing body warmth, and the stale air heavy with soot and sweat. It was a hard life, but somehow joy still flickered in the crack. On special nights, village fires crackled in the square. People emerged from their huts for a rare taste of warmth and laughter. They shared jokes, songs, and stories. For a few precious moments, they weren't just surviving, they were living. Children shouted with glee as they skated and slid on frozen ponds. Young lovers stole kisses beneath moonlit trees, undeterred by the cold. Even elders, bent by age and winter's weight, felt themselves lifted by these moments. The laughter, the closeness, the feeling of being alive. These were the memories that kept them going, but those brief joys couldn't mask the ever-present fear. Hunger. The fields were dead under snow. No crops grew, bellies ached. A failed harvest meant entire villages might perish. Mothers watched helplessly as their children's cheeks sank and their eyes lost their spark. Hunger was a slow thief, stealing life by inches, and when things grew desperate, people did unthinkable things. Whispers of cannibalism crept through towns like ghosts. Dark rumors no one dared confirm, but everyone feared. Hunger wasn't the only enemy. Illness prowled in the cold. Pneumonia and fever swept through homes. The sick coughed and shook beside dwindling fires, while loved ones could do nothing but watch. Children were especially vulnerable, so were the old. Diseases came fast and left devastation behind. And then there were the travelers, merchants, messengers, or wanderers, forced onto frozen roads. They faced blizzards, black ice, and unseen crevices. Many never made it. Come spring, their frozen bodies were found in drifts or ditches, twisted in shapes that told quiet, final stories of struggle. Even the valiant knights, those proud warriors of the realm, were not immune to winter's cruelty. Their heavy armor meant for battle became a burden against the cold. Frost crept into every seam and rivet. Fingers, numb inside steel gauntlets, lost their grip. Clumsy hands struggled to draw swords or raise shields. Mighty war horses faltered in snowdrifts, their flanks crusted with ice. Brave charges turned sluggish. Glorious banners froze stiff in the wind. Winter made even heroes feel helpless. In royal halls, kings and queens weren't spared either. The crown weighed heavier during those bitter months. Monarchs could not command the seasons to change. They watched their treasuries drain, not from war or opulence, but from firewood and grain. Keeping castles warm and the court fed cost a fortune. Meanwhile, merchants seized the moment, raising prices as desperation grew. But even in the darkest depths of the season, people clung to small lights of joy. One such moment came during the feast of St. Stephen. For a single, rowdy day, the rules were flipped. A peasant might be crowned the Lord of Misrule. Drunken laughter echoed through towns. Songs, some bawdy, some joyful, filled the night air. People danced, toasted, and forgot the cold, if only for a few stolen hours. Then, quietly, winter loosened its grip. The icicles began to drip, the low sun grew stronger each day, snowdrops and crocuses dared to bloom through thawing soil, delicate signs that life was returning. Hearts lifted, fields stirred, villages prepared for planting. The feast of the plow, a springtime celebration, marked the return of fertility and hope. Farmers led oxen across fur earth, drawing the first furrows of the new season. The green came back. The hard memories of winter began to soften. Looking back, we can't help but marvel at the resilience of those who lived through these medieval winters. Year after year, they survived with a courage born of necessity. They didn't just endure the cold. They built community around it. Shared hardship became shared strength. Today we complain about frozen sidewalks or a delayed flight, but those are small discomforts compared to what our ancestors faced. No heat, no running water, no medicine, just the long, brutal cold and their determination to make it through. As we settle into our warm beds tonight, let us remember them. Let us honor the strength they passed down to us. In our dreams, maybe, we'll glimpse their world, a harsher, colder place, but one where the human spirit burned brightly, defying even the longest night. As winter once again descended over medieval Europe, it brought with it a bone-deep chill that blanketed every corner of life. For the peasants, it meant another season of bitter endurance. Wrapped in little more than rags, with bellies often empty, they braced themselves in drafty huts as cold winds howled outside. Inside, the only warmth came from crowding together with family, and sometimes even livestock. The air was thick with the smell of damp straw, human sweat, and animal breath. Illness spread quickly, coughs echoed through dark corners, the sick had little rest, and even less hope. And yet, the wealthy were not untouchable. Castles, those grand stone fortresses, became frozen tombs in winter. Fires roared in the hearths, but the chill crept in from below and above. The stone absorbed the cold and pushed it into every chamber. Even royalty, dressed in thick furs and seated beside flames, couldn't escape winter's grasp. One haunting story tells of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, consort of Edward IV of England, who supposedly froze to death in her chambers one particularly harsh night. While historians debate its truth, the tale captured something deeper than fact, the understanding that even queens were vulnerable when winter struck. Winter, for all its cruelty, was a great equalizer. No amount of status or silver could keep out the frost completely. The same cold that turned peasants' toes purple also rattled the tapestries in royal bedchambers. No one was exempt. Everyone, laborers and laborers alike, prepared as best they could. Food stores were checked and rechecked. Every log and scrap of wood was stacked with care. Heavy cloaks were brought out, mended again and again, ready for another battle with the cold. Yet in the middle of all this grim anticipation, there was a spark of joy. Christmas, especially on the feast of St. Stephen, December 26th, medieval people carved out a space for celebration. Laughter and music filled halls and huts alike. People shared what little they had. For a few moments, the weight of winter lifted. It was during these festivals that community and hope flourished. And perhaps, in that dark season, hope was the greatest warmth of all. For a few fleeting days, the normal rules of medieval society were turned on their head. During the holiday season, especially on St. Stephen's Day, villages appointed a lord of misrule from among the peasantry. This lucky figure presided over feasts, dancing, games, and pure mischief. Laughter echoed through cottages and castle halls alike. Bellies were full of ale and wine. Faces were flushed from dancing, singing in the warmth of close company. It was a break from the grind of hardship, a rare, bright flame in the middle of a long, cold tunnel. You could imagine the scenes. Halls and village squares erupted in celebration. Reed pipes squealed, fiddles played, and crowds spun in joyful chaos. For a moment, social lines blurred. Lords and peasants danced side by side, laughing like equals. The lord of misrule, perhaps a grinning young farmhand drunk with sudden power, issued silly commands to cheers and applause. It was chaos, it was joy, and it was precious. But like all things in winter, the joy didn't last. Eventually, the Yule log burned low, the wassail bowl ran dry. People returned to their homes, dragging their tired feet back to reality. The warmth of celebration gave way to the deep cold once more. St. Stephen's Day was over. The Lord of Misrule returned to his place among the laborers. The smiles faded, survival took center stage again. Time slowed to a crawl. The fields were frozen, unusable. The sun was scarce. The wind cut deep. There was little work to do and even less reason to go outside. Days blurred together in a gray haze. Nights felt endless. In that bitter stillness, hope became both a weapon and a burden. Families sat close, bundled in itchy wool. They stared into dim fires, wondering if spring would ever come. And yet, deep beneath the frozen soil, life stirred. Tiny green shoots waited, hidden and patient. Those who endured, who clung to each other and refused to surrender, would eventually feel the warmth again. On Plough Monday, just after Epiphany, the ground would soften. Hands would grasp wooden ploughs once more, carts would roll, animals would be led to fresh grass, and the cycle of life would begin again. But that day hadn't arrived yet. For now, winter still ruled with a cold, iron grip. And once more, the people of the Middle Ages braced themselves to outlast it. In the depths of winter, with snow piled high and winds wailing through the trees, people turned inward. Their food stores, carefully rationed since the last harvest, grew smaller by the day. Yet even more than they needed warmth or grain, they needed each other. The shared struggle, lords and peasants alike, bound them together. Beneath the same gray, freezing sky, they waited for the light, waited for the thaw, waited for the moment the world would turn from gray to green again. So they huddled together, drawing close in drafty huts or vast stone halls, spinning tales, sharing songs, and whispering prayers. Sometimes they dreamed aloud of brighter futures, warmer hearths, full bellies, and gentler seasons. Other times they simply tried to survive one more night, clinging to slivers of hope like firelight in the dark. It's awe-inspiring to think about the strength it took to keep going. These people didn't just suffer, they endured. Every harsh winter chipped away at them, yet every spring saw them rise again. The human spirit, faced with darkness, chose to burn brighter. Today, it's easy to forget what they endured. Central heating hums in our homes, lights flick on with a switch, food arrives at our doors with a tap. But back then, every fire lit, every loaf baked, every winter survived. It was a triumph, a quiet, determined victory. So as we wrap ourselves in blankets and settle into our beds, let's remember them. Those men and women who faced unthinkable cold, hunger, and sickness, but who held on. Their resilience still warms us today. Their stories, passed down through time, remind us that no winter lasts forever. Because what they taught us, what they proved again and again, is simple but powerful. Even the harshest winters can't extinguish hope. During the final days of the deep freeze, something extraordinary stirred within the hearts of even the most worn-down villagers. Streets filled with laughter as the Lord of Misrule led the way, encouraging mischief and merrymaking. From nobles to peasants, no one was spared from the joyful chaos. Minstrels, jugglers, and jesters performed their tricks. Children played games of skill and luck while the adults watched. Comedic mummers plays, over-the-top skits full of exaggerated gestures and legendary tales. Mock jousts and parody trials kept the crowds roaring with laughter, offering a much-needed break from the constant hardship. For once, even the cold seemed to retreat, driven back by the power of shared joy. No feast was quite like the one held on St. Stephen's Day. In many places, the Lord of Misrule could command the wealthy to provide food and drink for all. Roasted meats filled the tables, geese, capons, and even boar's head marched in with pomp and cheers. Spiced pies and dried fruit sweetened the mood, and the wassail bowl made its rounds. Warm cider filled cold bellies, and voices rose in song. For a brief moment, winter's grip loosened. Laughter rose above the howling wind. Smiles flickered even on weary faces. And when the celebration ended and people returned to their homes, they carried a spark with them. The memory of joy, of shared food, of community. That spark burned through the coldest nights. And then, at last, the thaw began. Snowdrops pushed through the slush. Tiny white petals nodded in defiance of the cold, brave and soft at once. The ground softened. Slumbering fields showed the first hints of life. Farmers brought their oxen to the fields. Livestock returned to pastures. The silence of snow gave way to birdsong. Everywhere, people looked up again. The long winter had nearly broken them. But spring, quiet and sure, had returned. The first Monday after Epiphany, falling in early January, was known as Plow Monday. It marked a turning point, the return to life after winter's stillness. The land could be worked again. Frozen earth softened under early sunlight. Villagers pulled their wooden plows from storage and paraded them through town, blessing them in ceremonies filled with joy and gratitude. Plowmen knocked on doors, collecting bits of food, jugs of ale, or small coins, each offering a tribute to the hard work and harvests ahead. Picture a weathered village, still bundled in winter's remnants, gathered around the thawing fields, faces turned upward toward a sky shifting from gray to pale blue. Children skipped between the furrows as elders pressed seeds into the soil. A grandmother, stooped and smiling, taught her grandchildren to plant peas just as her own grandmother had taught her. A giggle broke the silence when a fat earthworm wriggled from the earth. The younger child squealed with delight. The older pushed a seed carefully into its place. It was in moments like this, when knowledge passed from old hands to small ones, that winter's hardship felt worth it. The grandmother's smile, her eyes wrinkled with warmth, was its own kind of spring. It promised that the dark days had passed. As green shoots began to push up through the soil, the spirit of winter loosened. The long grip of cold and quiet gave way to warmth, to laughter, to the rhythm of growth. Looking back now, it's humbling to realize how strong these people were. Without modern comforts, they faced winters that tested every part of them. Surviving each one was a triumph of will and heart. And through it all, they found reasons to hope. They sang, they danced, they laughed together by the fire, the strength of community, the joy of a warm meal, the sight of that first crocus bloom. These were the things that carried them through. Today, when the wind rattles our windows and we grumble at the cold, we can think of them. They endured far worse. And yet, they found joy. They planted seeds in frozen earth and believed in spring. So tonight, as you settle beneath your warm blanket, remember this. Their spirit lives in us. That ember of resilience, that deep knowledge that winter will end. It still burns. Spring always returns. Life always goes on, no matter how dark the night.